Hopefully, fingers crossed for next time if you're unsuccessful this year. On to the main business of the evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ewan Rhys-Morris, who is a historian of science and professor of history at Aberystwyth University. He studied natural science at Cambridge and completed his PhD there in history of philosophy of science. He's also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and of the Learned Society of Wales. He's written a number of highly acclaimed books, including the Oxford History of Science, and his most recent books are Nikola Tesla and the Electrical Future, of which I think we'll hear a little more shortly, and the most recent one, How the Victorians Took Us to the Moon, from a couple of years ago. I think we're in for a treat. With regard to questions, if you have for Prof. Morris, if you could type it into the chat, so that we can keep an eye on all the questions, and I'll ask those on your behalf at the end of the lecture. But in the meantime, it's over to you, Ewan.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael, for that kind introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, albeit virtually. I feel that I've got some degree of affinity with radiologists, since my big sister is a radiology consultant, so there's that connection at the very least. And well, as the title of one of those prize-winning essays indicated, I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in as a historian is electrotherapy in a more general context of the way people thought about electricity in the body. And of course, electrotherapy is the direct ancestor of the sorts of things that you do now. But anyway, Nikola Tesla. I'm going to try sharing screen now, and hopefully it will work, and then I can get going. Can you now see the screen? Yeah, excellent. All I need to do now is figure out where the toggles are. There we go. Right, Nikola Tesla. As I said in the little abstract that I sent in a few days ago, Tesla's really is a name to conjure with. Widely and often hailed as a forgotten genius, though as forgotten geniuses go, he's clearly a pretty well-known man of invention. If any of you are fans of the American TV sitcom Big Bang Theory, you'll have heard Tesla being name-checked any number of times. If you have teenagers of the appropriate age, you may have come across the Disney cartoon Gravity Falls. I was watching Gravity Falls one evening, and they had an image of an industrious lone inventor working in his lab. And there's this poster on the wall behind him. And I looked a bit more closely. Yes, it was a poster of Nikola Tesla. So he turns up everywhere. He's got a car named after him. He has scientific units named after him. He's featured in, I think, at least one episode of Doctor Who. He's had at least 2 Hollywood movies made about him in the last few years. So yes, he's a very, very forgotten genius. And he's surrounded by mythology. That's what's being churned out in the Big Bang Theory, for example, when Sheldon talks about Tesla. He invented free energy. He wanted to supply free electricity to the world. He wanted to do all kinds of marvelous things, none of which are precisely true. So what I want to try and do in this lecture, at any rate, is give some kind of indication of what Tesla was really trying to do with his work in electricity, primarily around about the end of the 19th century. So here we go. And I hope that you're now looking at a picture. I was extremely pleased with myself when I happened upon this particular image. I can't quite remember the circumstances. It's actually from a book written in 1922, a book called Radio for All. It's authored by a guy called Hugo Gernsback. Those of you who are science fiction fans may have come across the name Hugo Gernsback. Um, Early 20th century, prolific publisher of um, popular science magazines and a variety of science fiction magazines, early science fiction as well. So a kind of key figure in the development of early SF. Was that this this image was published in 1922, and it's an image of a Nikola Tesla future. I mean, let me introduce you to some of the features. If you haven't started looking at them already, where are we? Here we have the radio power distributor. This was Tesla's great work. What Gernsback is portraying here is a version of the huge tower that Tesla had constructed in Wardenclyffe, just outside New York, right at the beginning of the 20th century, as part of his huge project to transmit huge quantities of electrical energy everywhere. I mean, this is what we're seeing here. This is kind of Tesla's dream come true. I mean, that's the that's the tower where the electricity would be being both created and transmitted across the globe, literally pumped through um, the earth, and the electricity that Tesla imagined being so pumped could basically power everything. So there in the distance, we can see crewless ships controlled by radio, and just above them here, radio-controlled airplanes. Um, Towards the end of the lecture, I'll be coming to, I mean, how Tesla imagined this kind of thing would be done. But I can't move on. I mean, if you look around, I mean, you'll see, there's a radio clock, correspondence by radio. What we're meant to be seeing is a business office of the future. So there's a late 20th century businessman, Gernsback. Imagine this scene as being 50 odd years or so in the future from its publication in 1922. So there's a radio business controller. There's the television and automatic radio phone. There's a radio heater down there on the far left-hand side. But this is my favorite. And it leads on quite nicely to some of the things that I want to say about Tesla later on. Radio-powered roller skates. And I'll read the quote here since it's quite interesting and revealing. In front of the bridge, we see a number of people. So behind just underneath the tower. In front of the bridge, we'll see a number of people who are propelled by radio power roller skates. On the heads, we see curious three-pronged metallic affairs. These collect the radio power from a nearby railing, which, however, is not in view and which they do not touch. The power is sent through space from the rail to the three-pronged affair and then is conveyed, obviously through the body, to the skates, which are operated by small electric motors. They roll at the rate of 15 to 20 miles an hour, and there's no visible connection between the wearer and the radio power distributor. That's a great intro, I think, to moving on to think a little bit more about, well, just exactly what Tesla was doing in the 1890s, because it's that image of passing electricity through the body, getting things to work through the body. That was absolutely central to the way that Tesla thought his electrical future was going to be made. So let's start with a little bit of background. Who was Nikola Tesla? There he is, a relatively unfamiliar image of Tesla. This is Tesla as he was in his early 20s, probably. So not yet arrived at anything like uh, the fame that he, the fame and the notoriety that he later achieved. Tesla was born in a little village called Smiljan. Uh, Smiljan was in what's now Croatia, but at the time when Tesla was born in the middle of the 19th century, Smiljan was right on the western boundaries of the Austrian Empire. Um, and in lots of ways, that's one of the reasons that people like the Tesla family were there. As I said, Smiljan now is in what's now part of Croatia. Uh, Tesla was a Serb, um, and there are a number of Serbs that have been settled essentially by the Austrians, by the Austrian Empire on the eastern frontiers of the empire, pretty much as cannon fodder. They were meant to be the first line of defense were the Ottomans to decide to cross the border and invade the Austrian Empire. So that's why Tesla and his family were there. Tesla himself came from a long line of military officers. Supposedly his grandfather, I think, was supposed to have been an officer in Napoleon's Grand Army. Tesla's father, on the other hand, was an Eastern Orthodox priest. And of course, Tesla being Tesla was born on the stroke of midnight on the 9th of July, at least 9th of July in the old Julian calendar. They were still followed at this point in Eastern Europe. And supposedly, at any rate, in the middle of a thunderstorm, or so family legend would have it. Apparently, allegedly at least, the midwife expressed fear that this was a child of dark, this was a child of the storm, and Tesla's mother's response was that no, Tesla was going to be a child of the light. As with much of what we know about Tesla's early life, these kinds of stories emerged in a series of articles that Tesla wrote in the early 20th century, around about 1920, as it happened, for another one of those magazines edited by Hugo Gernsback. This one was called The Electrical Experimenter. Gernsback by now was something of a Tesla patron. And it seems likely, at least, that he'd asked Tesla to write these articles for him, giving a bit of autobiography. I mean, at least partially as an excuse for giving Tesla money, since Tesla by now was quite badly off, sort of moving from hotel to hotel as it became clear to the hotel managers that he wasn't going to be able to pay his bills. And a lot of what Tesla writes about his early life is clearly intended to convey a very specific image of himself as a particular kind of individual. That's where the thunderstorm story turns up. There's another wonderful story in which he says he first encountered electricity stroking the family cat, Macaque, and having sparks fly from the fur onto his fingers, and his father explaining to him that this was electricity in just the same way that the thunderstorm was electricity, and Tesla vowing that he would one day capture the power of electricity himself, and portrays himself as having an inventive mind from a very early age. So this, for example, he's describing ideas he had as a child. Another of my projects was to construct a ring around the equator, which would, of course, float freely and could be arrested in its spinning motion by reactionary forces, thus enabling travel at a rate of about 1,000 miles an hour, impracticable by rail. It's a nice little story, whether or not it's true. And if there is anything in it, then it's a nice reminder that even at the kind of furthest edges of Western Europe by the middle of the 19th century. The tentacles of progress, so to speak, were spreading already. Tesla, even just going to local schools, would be becoming aware of what was going on in the technological, the growing technological world around him. So he's encountering science, he's encountering natural philosophy, he's encountering engineering from a pretty early age. He goes to school initially around about the local area. Then he's sent away to Karlovac to stay with relatives, to go to the gymnasium there. At this stage, he's intended for the priesthood. His father, himself an Eastern Orthodox priest, wants Tesla to follow in his footsteps. Tesla doesn't want to follow in his footsteps. Tesla has already decided that he wants to be an engineer. It takes a great deal of work for him, and in fact, it takes an almost deadly illness for him to persuade his father to let him be an engineer rather than a priest. His father then sends him to Graz, to the Polytechnic there, which at this stage was one of just a handful of universities in the Austrian Empire where it was possible to study. Where it was possible to study electricity, where it was possible to study engineering. So he goes to Graz, studies there for a number of years, and drops out. In lots of ways, this is a constant throughout Tesla's life. He clearly had difficulty, how shall I put it, in disciplining himself to stay in one place. Terribly wrong. He dropped out of Graz Polytechnic, and his living in various ways for a few years. Then enrolled at Karl Ferdinand University in Prague. Again, to study electricity, study engineering. And yes, you've guessed it. Again, he drops out. So Tesla never actually completed formal education. But clearly also along the way, he picked up a great deal of scientific knowledge. He picked up a great deal of mathematics. He picked up much of the latest work on electrical technology in electrical engineering. This is the age of the telegraph. This is the age of the telephone is about to be invented. It's the process of being invented. So telegraph lines are proliferating all over the place. Electrical invention seems like a promising line, so to speak, and that's where Tesla, even out where he is on the edges of empire, that's where Tesla sees himself as going. And he's thinking about invention along the way. He's thinking about how to invent, what to invent, thinking about what the process of invention. How does he himself go about inventing? Again, this is a nice little quotation that gives us a sense of who Tesla in his early 20s, or at least how Tesla in middle age, looking back at his early 20s, saw himself. He says things like this over and over again in this series of articles in the Electrical Experimenter. It's all published later in a single book, My Inventions by Nikola Tesla. He invented, he says, by producing an image of what he wanted to do in his head. This is what he's describing here. He creates this kind of mental image of the invention of the device, whatever it is that he wants to invent. When I've gone so far as to embody an invention, every possible improvement I can think of and see no fault anywhere, I put into concrete form this final product of my brain. Invariably, my device works as I conceived that it should, and the experiment comes out exactly as I planned it. It's a very, very, very long time indeed since I did any experiments. But I don't seem to remember my experiments at any rate coming out exactly as I planned it. Rather the opposite. Experiments, in my experience, take quite a lot of jiggering and playing around with to get them to work. But no, Tesla's line was he imagines it all in his head, and by the time it's transformed, by the time it produces on paper, or by the time it's made out of wood and glass and iron or whatever, it works perfectly because it's been perfectly conceived in Tesla's head. So, where does Tesla go? Here we have possibly a slightly more familiar image of the man. Tesla got a job in 1881 working in the Budapest Central Telegraph Station. He didn't stay there long. But again, we can imagine this as giving him an opportunity to combine the sort of theoretical work that he'd have learned at Graz and in Prague with kind of practical hands-on work. I mean, that's what work. That's what engineers at telegraph stations did. I mean, it was their job to give these to keep these telegraph cables, these cables on which increasingly the work of empires depended, to keep these cables working. So a practical familiarity with how instruments work, how they might be improved. I mean, what to do with this kind of apparatus, how to get it to work to its best advantage. So he's developing this kind of combination of theory and practice that was going to fuel his career through the 1880s and into the 1890s and beyond. He didn't stay long in Budapest. It wasn't long before he came west and came to Paris in 1882. He got a job in Paris working for the Société Électrique Edison. And yes, this is Thomas Alva Edison. Edison, at the beginning of the 1880s, was clawing himself into a position of power within the nascent electrical power industry. He'd made himself famous with the invention of the phonograph. Around by the beginning of the 1880s, he's starting to establish power stations in New York, distributing electricity, direct current electricity to New York neighborhoods. And in 1881, Edison himself went to Paris. There's a great international electrical exhibition being held in Paris that year. So Edison came there with all of his paraphernalia and put on an amazing show of electrical power and starts trying to aggressively push into the European marketplace. And what Edison did was essentially establish subsidiary companies like the Société Électrique Edison in Paris, other equivalents elsewhere in Europe, in London, for example, trying to establish local electrical power companies. And that's where Tesla went to work whilst he was working for Edison in Paris, spent some time in Strasbourg on the Franco-German border, on the German side, since it's after the Franco-Prussian War, and spent some time helping establish electrical power networks there. And then in 1884, he takes the great step and he emigrates to New York, there to work at the Edison Machine Works, doing in New York, doing closer to the center of Edison's power, if you like, more or less the kinds of things that I've been doing as an electrical engineer working for the Société Électrique Edison. So in 1884, this is where we find Tesla. He's a young man on the make. And he's a young man who clearly had a very high opinion of himself. He's there to work as part of Edison's team, of similarly bright young men. Um, One of Edison's characteristics as an inventor was that he understood that invention isn't, so to speak, a solitary business, that invention requires collaboration, invention requires collective work. So Edison in his laboratories hired a lot of young men like Tesla, uh, good electrical engineering backgrounds, to do a lot of the legwork for him, so to speak. I mean, that's what Tesla was expected to do. Um, Tesla did not last very long in Edison's employ. Um, Tesla had his own very pronounced ideas of what the electrical future should be like, how electrical power networks should be developed. He had his own ideas in this instance about developing a network of arc lights, big sparks as a source of illumination. Edison wasn't interested in that. Edison was interested in pushing his incandescent light bulb system. Uh, Tesla sulked, and Tesla left Edison's employ. And thus started, or maybe didn't start, the great feud between Tesla and Edison, which is one of those features of the Tesla mythology. It may or may not be the case that Tesla imagined himself as having a feud with Edison. Um, I'm firmly of the view that Edison certainly didn't regard himself as having a feud with Tesla. Tesla, as far as Edison was concerned, was simply another young upstart electrical engineer who'd spent a few months in his employ and then had gone, had moved on to other things. Having left Edison's company, Tesla tried to set himself up as a jobbing, as an independent electrical inventor and as an independent electrical engineer. And again, I mean, lots of people were doing things like that during the 1880s. Edison had shown the way. There was clearly money in electricity. There's clearly money in electrical power. Everybody knew already that there was money in telephony and telegraphy. So lots of ambitious young men like Tesla trying to find that invention, that thing that was going to make their fortune. It took Tesla a while. He even had to spend some time literally digging ditches to earn a living whilst he was beavering away at invention. But eventually he came up with his great idea. Tesla invented a new kind of electric motor. Electrical motors have been around for half a century, at least by now. By the end of the 1880s, Tesla took out this patent in 1888. But all of these electrical motors, by and large, typically worked from direct current. It was possible to get direct current motors to work with from an AC system, but it was difficult, it was awkward, it was complex, it was cumbersome. Tesla's invention, the polyphase motor, as he called it, worked directly by AC. That was its defining feature. Lots of other electricians have been trying to figure out things like this, but Tesla succeeded. He wangled an invitation to give a lecture at the American Institution of Electrical Engineers in 1888, Columbia University, presented his new invention, put it through its paces, and wowed the audience. So suddenly Tesla was a name that electrical engineers, at any rate, had heard of. And he immediately, very, very quickly, comes to the attention of the gentleman on the left. The gentleman on the right, I hope you recognize. That's Thomas Alva Edison. The gentleman on the left is, or was, George Westinghouse. Edison, as I mentioned, was a promoter of direct current electrical power distribution networks. That's what he was trying to sell. I mean, that's what he built and was spreading out from New York. Westinghouse, on the other hand, was trying to develop alternating current power systems. Um, the sorts of systems that Edison was developing, direct current systems, worked well and efficiently over relatively small distances. Say a city block or a couple of city blocks. After that, there was too much energy loss for them to be efficient. The sort of system that Westinghouse wanted to develop, alternating current systems, work far better over longer distance. They lost less energy in the process. So it had various advantages over AC, over DC. And indeed, around by this time in Britain, for example, Sebastian Di Ferrante in London was building the Deptford Power Station, which was going to work entirely from alternating current. But one of the problems that AC had was that it was difficult to get motors to work from it. So when Westinghouse latched onto Tesla's patent, latched onto Tesla's idea about his polyphase motor, then, I mean, this was another weapon in his campaign to display the superiority of alternating power systems over the Edison DC systems. So he buys Tesla's patent, gives Tesla a share, gives Tesla a job in the Westinghouse company, essentially to turn the polyphase motor that existed clearly perfectly in Tesla's mind, as we've seen, but in actuality really needed a bit more work to turn it into a practical, economic, working machine. Again, Tesla didn't last very long in Westinghouse's employ. He wasn't very good at working for other people, shall we say. And that really is. I mean, Tesla's often portrayed as a key figure in the battle of the systems, the war of the currents. That's the minor role that Tesla really played. But he was now an established electrical engineer. People knew about him. He was in a position to start to make his way as an engineer. And then, so to speak, he struck gold, or at least for a while, it looked as if he struck gold. In 1892, Tesla gave a series, what turned into a series of 3 lectures, one in New York at Columbia University, then in London at the Royal Institution, speaking in front of the Institution of Electrical Engineers, and then in Paris in front of the Société de Télégraphe Électrique. And what we can see in this picture here is Tesla's performance. Imagine him on stage. He's walking around. He's holding these long glass tubes in his hands. I imagine them as being a little bit like Star Wars lightsabers. He's sort of waving them around. They're illuminated somehow or other. There are no wires, nothing else. There's no other obvious connection, but he's passing huge quantities of electricity through his own body. He's illuminating things like these, long glass tubes. He's literally displaying with his own body what he's announcing as the future of electricity. So he gives his lecture in New York. He comes to Europe. He performs twice at the Royal Institution, once for the Institute of Electrical Engineers, who have borrowed the Royal Institution essentially for this performance, but they've only been allowed to borrow it if Tesla then gives another lecture the following night to the Royal Institution's members, and then he's off to Paris to do the same thing again. And here it is. I mean, here's a piece from the lecture. Here is a simple glass tube from which the air has been partially exhausted. I take hold of it. I bring my body in contact with a wire conveying alternating currents of high potential. and the tube in my hand is brilliantly lighted. Here is an exalted bulb suspended from a single wire. Standing on an insulated support, I grasp it, and a platinum button mounted on it is brought to vivid incandescence. I stand on this platform, I bring my body in contact with one of the terminals of the secondary of this induction coil, with the end of a wire many miles long, and you see streams of light break forth from its distant end, which is set in violent vibration. What Tesla had invented was what he called an oscillating transformer, what we call a Tesla coil, essentially, generating electricity at very, very, very high, very, very high current, very, very high frequency. And in those circumstances, most electricity essentially flows along the surface of the body, as I'm sure you know. And therefore, you can pass huge quantities of electricity through, or rather over, yourself without dropping dead as a consequence. Oops, let's go back. He invites all kinds of celebrities into his laboratory in New York to try it all out for themselves, because Tesla is by now a celebrity. Those 3 lectures make Tesla famous, and not just famous as an electrical engineer. When Tesla left New York to go to Europe, he left an unknown electrical engineer. When he comes back, the press reports that Mr. Tesla is coming back from Europe. He's now a name. He's now somebody to reckon with. And he duly hangs around with celebrities, dines at Delmonico's with, amongst others, Mark Twain. This is Mark Twain in the image here, and he's holding a Tesla illuminated globe in his hands. I mean, he dines at Delmonico's. He's living at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel by this stage. And he's trying to sell this electrical future. What he wants to do is create a world, create machinery where huge quantities of electrical energy will be kind of pumped through the air, will be generated using steam engines or the power of Niagara, what have you, and then transmitted through the air, through the earth, to wherever you want it, essentially, and then passed on from one of those towers to be used by anybody. Well, used by anybody who is paying to use the electricity. Somebody who has access to the right kind of machinery. Tesla was no exponent of free energy. On the contrary, Tesla was very interested in making his fortune out of all of this. And he's creating this very specific image of himself. When I was writing the Tesla book, I mean, one of the things I was reading lots of newspaper reports from the 1890s. And the number of times when I read was along the lines of, I was honored to be invited into the laboratory of the reclusive Mr. Tesla. Well, an awful lot of journalists were being invited into the laboratory of the reclusive Mr. Tesla. And the reclusive Mr. Tesla, in the meantime, was, as I said, dining at Delmonico's. He was out there. He was hustling for money because he needed a lot of money to move on to the next step of his grand project. And here's the next step, really. Around about 1900, Tesla decamped from New York. He went west. He went to Colorado Springs and built his laboratory there, out in the hills outside Colorado Springs. He wanted to scale up his oscillating transformer. He wanted to scale up this machine that he'd invented so that it could literally, pump huge quantities of energy through the atmosphere, through the air. Having succeeded to his satisfaction, he came back to New York. He persuaded J.P. Morgan to give him $130,000. And with that money, he built the tower that you can see on the right there at Wardenclyffe on Long Island outside New York. And the point to that tower was to show the feasibility of his system for transmitting not just not just kind of little radio waves, so to speak. I mean, whilst Tesla's doing this, Marconi is inventing wireless telegraphy, what we now think of as radio. Tesla was very sniffy about Marconi, and this is child stuff. What Tesla wanted to do was send torrents of electricity through the earth, through the atmosphere, to power aeroplanes, to power machines, to power boats out at sea, to power everything. That was the fantasy that Tesla had. And if we go back to that image with which I started this lecture, that's the future that Tesla wanted to sell his audience. That's the future he wanted to sell journalists. That's the future he wanted to sell financiers like J.P. Morgan, who are going to make him rich. Unfortunately, it didn't work. I mean, it isn't actually entirely clear still how precisely Tesla thought the tower the tower at Wardenclyffe was going to transmit energy in the way that he thought that it would. But I mean, that was the fantasy that Tesla had developed by the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the things that's fascinating about it, I think, is the way that throughout, I mean, he's literally putting his own body in the middle of it all. You can see the image here. The image here, it's quite a famous image. Less well known, possibly, as the fact that it's a fake. Not even Tesla was foolish enough to put himself quite so close to quite as much electrical energy as is being transmitted here. But it's a nice example, it's a nice metaphor, if you like, for the way in which Tesla wanted everybody to come through him, so to speak, to get at the electrical future. If you wanted this world of ubiquitous electricity, then you had to pay Tesla to produce that world for you. I mean, it's putting himself in the middle. Now, this is actually a quotation from the Canadian sociologist and media theorist Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan here, he's the medium is the message. He's the medium is the message guy. McLuhan here was talking about new electrical technologies in the 19th century. He's thinking about things like telegraphy, telephony, and so forth, and what the relationship was between those new technologies and the bodies and, as I said here, the nervous system. Whereas all previous technology had, in effect, extended some part of our bodies. So steam engines make our muscles more powerful. Electricity may be said to have altered the central nervous system itself, including the brain. And I remember when the first time I saw that quotation in The Extensions of Man, it struck me as very familiar because in all sorts of ways, actually, 19th century electricians, electrical engineers, and medical men said similar sorts of things about how they saw the relationship between the telegraph in particular and the nervous system. Here is a quotation from Balfour Stewart at Manchester. Let us suppose that a war is being carried on by a vast army, at the head of which there is a very great commander. Now, this commander knows too well to expose his person. In truth, he is never seen by any of his subordinates. He remains at work in a well-guarded room from which telegraphic wires lead to the headquarters of the various divisions. He can thus, by means of these wires, transmit his orders to the generals of the divisions, and by the same means receive back information as to the condition of each. That's Balfour Stewart using the telegraph as a metaphor for the brain and nervous system. The brain is the great commander who's hidden away in the well-guarded room, and the nerves are the telegraphic wires that lead to the headquarters of the various divisions. And it's a very, very common metaphor. Telegraphs are something like nerves, and nerves are something like telegraphs. That's a very common way of understanding, both the nervous system and telegraphy during the second half of the 19th century. And Tesla says things that aren't entirely dissimilar. This is Tesla. He's writing in an article called "On the Increase of Human Energy," published in the Century magazine, if I remember rightly, right about in 1898, possibly somewhere around there. He's talking about how to end wars. How can we stop all war? To bring on this result, men must be dispensed with. Machine must fight machine. But how to accomplish that which seems impossible? The answer is simple enough. Produce a machine capable of acting as a part of a human being. No mere mechanical contrivance comprising levers, screws, wheels, clutches, and nothing more, but a machine embodying a higher principle, which will enable it to perform its duties as though it had intelligence, experience, reason, judgment, a mind. He sees this, he's doing a bit of quick reevaluating of what he had been doing in the 1890s to show this, so to speak, as the end of what he was trying to achieve. He was imagining this world where, yes, I mean, electricity would be transmitted from one of generated and transmitted from one of those huge towers. It would run those boats, it would run those airplanes, it would run those electrical roller skates, and it would all happen at a distance. That the intelligence controlling it all would be at a distance from where everything was going on. And he had a prototype. Tesla invented, the many things he was inventing during this period, was a remote control guided torpedo. And again, I mean, he was pushing this as, this is another one of those weapons that can end all wars. Torpedo would be able to be guided at a distance, so sneak up to a battleship without being seen, all radio controlled, and would blow up the battleship. And the fantasy was that, well, if everybody has something like this, then battleships would be useless, so you wouldn't be able to have naval battles, and so on and so on. Many commentators at the time pointed out there's some various obvious rudimentary problems with this vision, none of which affected Tesla in the least. He promised that he would put the apparatus on display at the Paris exhibition in 1900. He didn't, obviously. And that was really the kind of, that was the high point of Tesla's career. Wardenclyffe, a few years later, was sold for scrap. It had become clear to the manager of the Waldorf Astoria that Tesla was never going to pay his bills. So the tower was demolished and sold for scrap. And Tesla spent the rest of his life, right? He dies in 1943, so well into the 20th century, trying to sell and sell again, this image of a world where wireless electricity would be everywhere. I mean, all they needed to do was give Tesla the money and he would produce this world for them. And he still made great copy. He argued for electrotherapy. This is from another article in the Electrical Experimenter in Gernsback's magazine. Again, how electricity could be transmitted from those towers to keep us all healthy. The unquestioned therapeutical effects of the human body are of great value, not only to the muscles, but the entire nervous system. Tesla currents, by softening the arteries, make the old feel younger, and the young, younger and more aggressive. Women, particularly, should derive great benefits from their future high-frequency dry baths. And this is how he was often portrayed in the papers. This is from 1901. Nikola Tesla shows how men of the future may become as gods. Again, arguing how his systems of wireless energy transmitted all over the place would give people hitherto unimaginable power. And the interesting thing in the end, and I'm ending now, is it was all going to be done by him alone. There's a fascinating image of the inventor as iconoclast, as disruptor, dare I say, that's invented by Tesla and people like him at the end of the 19th century, where they're presenting themselves as, I mean, almost literally the gatekeepers of the future. That if you want the future, you have to come through us. You have to buy into our technologies. You have to go through the route that we offer us. That's the kind of invention of a particular kind of invention, which I think is what makes Tesla still such a seductive figure for some people still in the modern world. Helps explain, for example, why that car is named after Tesla. Anyway, I will end now. I hope you've all enjoyed, and I look forward to your questions.